My name's Adela and I make minis. This month I've challenged myself to make 100 I started this week off with another Tulipier inspired shape. I'm a big fan, but I don't feel like I've ever managed to nail it. So, once I've pinched out the two halves of my body and joined them together, I begin to make the spouts. I decided to make 3 for this one so that I can make the openings bigger. I then smoothed out the transition from body to neck with some tiny clay sausages and pinched out some tiny lips or rims. At this stage, I felt like it was missing something, so I tried out some handles, but they weren't working at all. I then had the idea of carving out some wide fluting, which gave it some lovely texture and finished it up really nicely. In the spirit of revisiting shapes, I decided to go back to that fun circular shape from day 20 today. Once I was happy with the shape of the body, I then moved on to the foot. I used my thimble as a template and then sculpted a little stalk. Making vases is a little bit of a balancing act, and once I'd cut out an opening and pinched out a little lip, I decided that the fancy foot I'd made was no longer working. So I ripped that one off and tried 3 little spindly legs, too spindly, the original foot but upside down, no thank you, and then finally 3 little stubby legs which just made it look like a cauldron. At this point it was back to the drawing board, so I took a quick picture and got to sketching. It turned out all I needed was a wider base. Once I was happy with how that was looking, I finished it up with some tiny handles. And what a cutie! For day 31, I wanted to make another larger mini. I really love how practical they are and they give you a few more options for those teeny tiny flowers. So once I'd pinched out my 2 halves, joined them together, and finished finalising the shape, I then moved on to the neck. Now for this vase, I knew I wanted to flare out the neck, so once it was attached to the body, I began to slowly pinch it out. However, it very quickly started to crack and the whole thing fell apart as the clay was just too thin. But instead of giving up on the idea, I had a cheeky little brainwave of pinching out a little dish. It's just like pinching out the 2 halves of the body and it ended up working really well. It seems like a super obvious way of making this shape now, but when you're really familiar with one way of working, it can get difficult to see other options. This is why it's good to push ideas and push the material because failure can sometimes lead to new ways of working. I decided to finish this guy off with some tiny little handles and a quick brush of white slip. I think this guy is great and I'm a really big fan of this funky little silhouette. Okay, so this one was a bit of a whirlwind, so I'm just going to give you the greatest hits. So, I started this one with the idea of pinching out 4 different halves and then mixing and matching them together into 2 holes. I then mashed those together, making sure to cut out an opening between them first. I also pinched out a little lip, but then quickly changed my mind and straightened it out again. I then tried some handles to lean into the melting vase vibe, but for some reason wasn't convinced. Since I was already backtracking, I also decided that the body was rubbish, so I began carving it down to lean into the rough rock vibe instead. I really wasn't loving my work at this point, so attempted handles again, still a no from me. I then smoothed out the carving because, surprise surprise, I didn't like that look anymore. And at this point, I gave up on the shape entirely, cut off the top third, flattened the curves completely. It was now looking a little bit like a shell, so on a hunch, I decided to add some little ridges, and after all that struggle, I came up with this little weirdo. So I wanted to carry on with yesterday's ridges and refine them a little bit because they actually looked kind of cool. So once I'd formed my body, I began to add tiny clay sausages all the way around. I would make sure to wet them and then I'd use my needle tool to blend them out. And once they were all attached, I then went in with a wet brush to really smooth things out. I then added a neck and redefined the ridges where I'd made the join. I'm actually really in love with this vase, and spoiler alert, It's going to be the best Ripley mini that I make this week, I think. It looks like a tiny little seed pod and there's so much movement in the clay. It almost looks like ruched fabric. I also made the ridges much denser, which I think is partly why it looks so good. And speaking of looking good, if you'd like to get your hands on any of the minis I make, they will be available through my website. Just keep an eye out for updates. For this piece, I wanted to add ridges to a shape that I was very familiar with to see how that would look. I decided to make that same Bronze Age silhouette I've been making for the last 2 weeks, as I thought it might work well. I also had the idea of incorporating the handles into the ridges as one longer sausage, and this ended up working fairly well, but they also looked a little bit too skinny and twiggy, so I reckon I'll try and double them up next time. Overall, I don't really think this one worked for me. I hadn't accounted for the fact that the added bulk would swallow up the shape of the body and make it look less defined. It's still a fun one though, especially once you add some flowers. I went for a really dramatic shape on day 35 with a nice taper, a sharp shoulder and a nice skinny neck. It's your classic amphora. I then set about adding my ridges, hoping that this time the more defined shape would combat the extra clay I was adding. I also made sure to double up on my handles this time and it really did look much better. I even extended the ridges over the foot to give it the appearance of roots and of one clean line from top to bottom. Overall, I'm not sure about this way of working. The results are definitely better the denser you make the ridges, and I feel like the only way to combat the silhouette from turning blobby is to make the sausages of clay so much smaller. It would make working on these a whole new level of fiddly and double the time it takes to make them, which would in turn mean I would have to charge more. It's a challenge that I'm definitely up for, but maybe I need a few days off first. And that was week 5. Let me know if you enjoyed the POV. I thought I'd give it a try, and if you're loving it, I will definitely do it again. I've got 65 more minis to make, and I hope you'll join me on this journey. Thank you so much for watching, and please do subscribe if you don't want to miss next week's.